It was a drizzly southern summer afternoon, thick with gray clouds and humidity, as my best friend Aisha and I drove down one of the more famous highways in the United States. Route 80 crosses through most of Alabama and the Southeast, but it's probably best known for that short portion that runs between Selma and Montgomery. There, along that 54-mile stretch of two-lane highway, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders marched from Selma to the state capitol in support of voting rights in 1965. Along the highway, markers commemorate where the marchers stopped to camp each night. And tucked away, next to a small AME Zion church, there's a memorial. If you weren't really looking for it, you would miss it altogether. Aisha and I did the first time we drove past, scouring the side of the highway through the rain coming down on our windshield. The memorial sits next to a small church on a green hill overlooking the road, and the large stone marker reads, "In memory of our sister Viola Liuzzo, who gave her life in the struggle for the right to vote, March 25th, 1965. The day we visited, there were fresh-cut flowers next to the marker. We stood for several moments in silence as the cars rushed past below." Some of you may have heard the name Viola Liuzzo before. She's known for having been a supporter of the civil rights movement, a white activist and ally who was murdered immediately following the march to Montgomery in 1965. You may also have heard of her because she was a Unitarian Universalist. The story goes that Liuzzo, then a 39-year-old mother of 5, heard about the voting rights organizing that was happening in Selma and felt called to respond. So she left her home and her family in Detroit and drove alone down to Alabama to help in whatever way she could. On March 25th, 1965, she was driving with a young black man from Selma on the way to Montgomery when 4 KKK members spotted them at a gas station. Incensed by the fact that a white woman and a black man were in a car together, the KKK men began to chase Liuzzo's Oldsmobile down the highway. They followed them for miles. Finally, when the Klansmen overtook the car, they fired, shooting Liuzzo in the face. She died instantly as her car veered off the road and into a ditch, just below where her memorial now stands. As the Klansmen chased Liuzzo off the road, she was singing the African-American spiritual, "We Shall Overcome." The opportunity to visit this memorial was incredibly powerful, and it stayed with me long after my travels through Alabama. I remember several weeks later recounting the story to my dad. After telling him the tragedy of Liuzzo's death, my father looked at me, eyebrows knit together with curiosity, and asked a simple but important question. Who was the black man in the car with Liuzzo? What happened to him? In that moment, I was rendered speechless, shocked by my own ignorance. I'm a historian, and I had completely missed a central part of the story. I had learned so much about the white woman who had been murdered. How was it possible that I didn't even know the name of the black man in the car with her? My cheeks flushed with embarrassment as I sat with the weight of my own internalized bias. And then I did the only thing that seemed appropriate given my historical orientation. I researched. This is what I found. His name was Leroy Moughton. He was a 19-year-old activist from Selma, a teenager determined to do what he could to advance civil rights for black people in his local community. He volunteered with organizers in Selma to help register people to vote. He helped plan the marches. Moughton was working with Liuzzo that night, shuttling people back and forth between Selma and Montgomery. When the shots were fired, the broken glass of the windshield sprayed Maughton in the face as the Oldsmobile swerved off the road. He played dead, lying covered in blood as the Klansmen came to inspect the car. They finally left, believing both of their victims had died. Maughton survived the heinous attack. In an interview in 2014, he said that he still thinks about that night all the time. I will always remember Leroy Maughton's name now, but it was a name that was surprisingly difficult to find information about. Viola Liuzzo is memorialized in many different places, and Maughton's name is almost never recognized except in connection with hers. I understand that a large part of the reason that Liuzzo is so celebrated is because her brave acts required her to give her life that night in 1965. I also know that for a long time, Liuzzo's story was not commemorated either, and I want to be clear that I am grateful that her life is honored. But how is it that we do not tell more stories about the young Black teenager, half Liuzzo's age, who was putting his life on the line every day for more justice in his hometown? How have we allowed Leroy Maughton's story to be erased? As some of you may have heard, or as you may have figured out at this point, I am a self-identified history nerd. I have a deep and abiding passion for history, especially Unitarian Universalist history. Now, there are many reasons why I love history. I love history because it's the closest I can get to time travel, to learning about people from distant places and eras. And I love history because I actually enjoy chronology and memorizing names and dates. But most importantly, I love history because I love people's stories. Now, while some people would have you believe that history is antiquated, I know that history is desperately alive. In the words of James Baldwin, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. All history shapes who we are. Not all history is remembered equally. And I worry that there are so many stories like Leroy Maughton's that we do not tell. So much has been forgotten. As a historian of U.S. religious history, I can tell you that for centuries, the stories of women and people of color have not been inscribed in our history textbooks or curriculum. As a society, we have a kind of selective memory, one that tends to prefer the stories of powerful, wealthy white men above anyone else. Erasing the history of marginalized people perpetuates cultural violence. Yet most of us, especially white people, collude in this silence because we are taught from a young age that silence is the only acceptable option. As children, especially white children, we weren't given the full truth of our histories, and when we did ask adults difficult questions, we were often scolded or given wrong answers. Most of us were never given the tools to process the complex reality of our collective past. And so the stories remain only half told, half-truths clouding our understanding of who we have been and who we are, alienating us from our communities and ourselves. Right now, our country has been swept up in a debate about monuments, about whom we choose to commemorate in the public square. This debate points to the gaping chasm between the full truth of history and our selective memory of it, between what actually happened and what we choose to remember. What are our own literal and metaphorical memorials and monuments in Unitarian Universalism? What do we celebrate, and what do we choose to forget? We UUs have plenty of stories that we do not tell. because they undermine our understanding of who we are. We want so desperately to answer the call of love, to believe that we have always been on the right side of history. And the truth of our history is, as all histories are, more complex than that. The truth is, there have certainly been times when we answered the call of love and promoted justice in the world. Prominent Unitarians and Universalists can be counted among abolitionists and women's rights activists. Many UUs fought at the vanguard of environmental justice and LGBTQ equality. The list goes on. And there are also stories of Unitarians and Universalists who were slave owners, who helped pass the Compromise of 1850 with the Fugitive Slave Act, who rejected women and LGBTQ people and people of color from our ministry for centuries. The legacy of our long-standing work for justice does not somehow make us immune to also participating in injustice. Our own collective history, just like that of our individual ones, contains multitudes, and there are profound consequences for the stories we choose to tell and the ones that we do not. I was reminded of these profound consequences a while back when I was invited to be a guest Sunday school teacher at a local Unitarian Universalist congregation. I was asked to be the guest historian for a class of 3rd through 6th graders, and as you can imagine, as a self-proclaimed history nerd, I was very excited. Not only did I have the chance to talk about UU history, but I was asked to speak about one of my favorite Unitarian Universalist figures of all time, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. A fearless and prophetic 19th century African-American abolitionist, women's rights activist, suffragist, poet, author, and earth-turning freedom fighter, Harper is quite possibly one of the most amazing people in Unitarian history. But that's a sermon for another day. As I sat down with the children that Sunday morning and began to tell the story of Harper's remarkable life, I passed around some pictures for the children to relate. While in the middle of waxing poetic about her many incredible accomplishments, I stopped in my tracks. A young black girl about 10 years old sitting next to me enthusiastically exclaimed, "Harper was African American? I'm African American too." In that moment, as I watched her cradle that picture of Harper with reverence and glee, I was overcome by emotion. I suddenly realized this was likely the first time this amazing, intelligent, insightful little girl had ever seen anyone who looked like her in our Unitarian Universalist history. How beautiful that she finally could. How heartbreaking that it took so long. The truth of our history matters. And the truth is that sometimes Unitarian Universalists have answered the call of love, and other times we've failed to do so. The truth is there have been people of color in our movement for centuries. The truth is that so often we do not know their names. The truth is that sometimes you can be a professional historian and still forget to research the story of an incredibly brave young black man because you are so focused on the story of the white woman heroine. The truth is that sometimes the best of our intentions still yield incredibly painful consequences. I know that has certainly been true in my own life. Trying to tell our histories more truthfully is the very beginning of a long-term healing process. It is not the whole solution, but rather one step toward undoing some of the cultural violence that has contributed to our present state of inequality. Ultimately, we cannot change our past, but acknowledging it can be a starting point, a foundation from which to build an even bolder and more just future. This work of truth-telling takes tremendous courage, and it can feel incredibly overwhelming at times. I know that as a white person who has often benefited from the half-truths of history, I can feel defensive and anxious when such conversations arise. Even after years of striving to unpack my own internalized racial bias, I still feel uncomfortable and uncertain when my shortcomings are examined. But as a historian, I also know that there are generations of people who passed before me, people who showed up and spoke the truth in the face of great discomfort and fear and uncertainty. As we heard this morning in the chalice lighting from Alice Walker, we are not the first to suffer, rebel, fight, love, and die. Those who came before us were not fearless or free of discomfort. Their courage was not some kind of superhero bravado. Our ancestors spoke truths in the face of fear. We do not have to be fearless. We do not have to be perfect. We do not have to have all the answers. We do need one another. We need this vibrant spiritual community to support us, to help us find the strength to tell our stories. It is not too late. Let's begin together. Let's begin today. May it be so. Amen.